What if I told you that the wealthiest Italian family in San Francisco history never struck gold, never owned a mine, and for the first few years after arriving, didn't even trust a bank enough to put their money in one? What if the real fortune builders of the gold rush era weren't the ones panning the rivers, but the ones standing on the shore selling bread, hauling fish, and quietly lending money to neighbors a bank wouldn't even look at? That's the story buried underneath North Beach, the strip of reclaimed shoreline that's still San Francisco's Little Italy today. It starts with a few hundred Italians chasing gold in 1850, and it ends, 2 generations later, with Genovese and Ligurian families who came in with almost nothing, owning fishing fleets, grocery storefronts, restaurants, and eventually a bank of their own that would one day become Bank of America. None of it happened by luck. It happened because of a set of money habits nobody wrote down as a system at the time. They just lived it, day after day, for 50 years. Here's what those habits actually were. Why didn't the gold make anyone rich? By 1850, there were roughly 229 Italians living in San Francisco, and the honest version of their gold rush story is almost anticlimactic. Most of the ones who actually went looking for gold figured out fast that mining was a brutal, low-odds way to make money, and a much smaller number of people standing at the edge of the gold fields, selling food, tools, transport, and labor to miners, were making steadier money than the miners themselves. So, a pattern set in early. Italians who'd come for the gold rush quickly pivoted toward land and service trades instead of staying in the mines, trading the lottery ticket economics of digging for something with worse upside but far better odds. That pivot matters because it's the first version of a habit that shows up again and again in this story: betting on the unglamorous, repeatable trade over the dramatic long shot. Who actually built North Beach, and why does the timeline matter? Here's where the story usually gets compressed in a way that isn't quite accurate. The Italian neighborhood people picture when they think of North Beach, Washington Square, the fishing fleets, Saints Peter and Paul Church, wasn't really built by the 1850 gold rush arrivals. It was built by a much bigger wave that started arriving in earnest in the 1870s, largely from Genoa and the Ligurian coast, drawn less by gold and more by San Francisco's booming economy and, critically, its ocean. These were people who already knew how to fish for a living, and the bay gave them a trade they could walk straight into without needing English, capital, or anyone's permission. By the 1890s and into 1900, the occupational pattern had sorted itself out with surprising specificity. Fishermen were largely Sicilian, truck farmers and agricultural laborers were predominantly Ligurian. Commission merchants tended to be Genovese, and street peddlers selling fish and produce were largely Lucchesi from Tuscany. So when people talk about North Beach Italians as one group, they're actually describing several overlapping regional economies that happen to share a few blocks of San Francisco. And each of those groups brought its own version of the money habits in this list. What did the wharf actually run on? The literal center of this economy was a stretch of water most tourists today have never heard of. Before Fisherman's Wharf existed in its modern location, the action happened at the Filbert Street Wharf, known at the time as Italy Harbor, which functioned as the hub of the fish trade until roughly 1900. Boats with the same lateen-rigged sail design used for centuries back in Italy would come in loaded with the day's catch, and peddlers, Chinese and Italian both, would haggle over it right there on the dock. This wasn't a tourist attraction. It was a cash economy running on volume, timing, and trust between people who saw each other every single day, which turns out to be the foundation almost every other money habit on this list was built on top of. Habit 1. Every household ran more than one income stream at once. A fisherman's wage, on paper, was one number. In practice, it was almost never the whole picture. A wife or daughter might be doing piecework at home, running a small front room shop, or taking in boarders. A son too young to fish full-time might be peddling produce or fish on the same wharf his father worked. The fishing income itself wasn't steady. Weather, season, and the catch itself swung wildly. So families layered other income on top of it specifically because they couldn't afford for one bad month at sea to be a crisis. This wasn't a strategy anyone articulated out loud. It was just what you did when the alternative was hunger during a slow week, and it meant that a single bad haul rarely sank an entire household's finances. Habit 2. Cash didn't sit in one place, and often didn't sit in a bank at all. For a long stretch of this period, formal banking simply wasn't built for Italian immigrants, and the distrust ran both directions. Many newly arrived families had little reason to trust institutions that didn't speak their dialect, didn't know their name, and in some cases, failed outright with depositors' money still inside them. So, cash got split. Some kept at home, some entrusted to a relative, some converted into something durable, like a small piece of land or equipment as fast as possible, rather than left sitting as paper that could be stolen, lost in a fire, or wiped out by an institution collapsing. The instinct wasn't financial sophistication in the modern sense. It was risk spreading born out of necessity, the same logic behind not keeping all your savings in one account today, just executed with far fewer protections available if it went wrong. Habit 3. The boat itself was the first business decision, not the only one. Owning a boat outright versus working someone else's was the single biggest financial fork in the road for a fisherman in this community, and the smart families treated the boat as a stepping stone rather than the destination. A felucca was expensive, and a fisherman who could save enough to own his boat outright, rather than fishing on shares for someone else, kept a much larger portion of every catch. But the real money, again and again in this community's history, came from the next move and after that. Taking the profits from fishing and converting them into something that didn't depend on the weather or the tides at all. One of the clearest examples of this pattern shows up in the story of a fisherman who decided it was simply more profitable to sell his boat, buy his fish from other fishermen instead of catching it himself, and put his full effort into running a storefront. And he wasn't alone in making that exact move. Several wharf families followed an almost identical arc. Years of fishing, then a pivot into restaurants, with some of the most recognizable Italian-American names in San Francisco history, Aliotto, Sabella, DiMaggio among them, building their later wealth on businesses that started as an extension of the family's fishing trade rather than a replacement for it. Habit 4. A stranger's word was worth more than a stranger's paperwork. Formal credit for most of this community in the late 1800s simply wasn't an option. Not because the demand wasn't there, but because banks weren't interested in lending to people whose names they couldn't pronounce and whose collateral they didn't understand. The gap got filled informally at first through relatives, paesani from the same village back in Liguria or Sicily, and community figures who functioned as de facto lenders inside a network where reputation was the only collateral that mattered. What makes North Beach's version of this story unusual is how directly it eventually led somewhere formal. The most famous example of this entire pattern is a banker who built an institution explicitly around the idea that a person's standing in the community was worth more than a stack of paperwork a downtown bank would have demanded. AP. Giannini's Banca d'Italia, which would later become Bank of America, lent money based on an individual's reputation in the Italian community rather than the conventional collateral requirements of the era. That single decision turned an entire neighborhood's informal trust network into something closer to a formal financial system. And it's hard to overstate how unusual that was for the time. A major American bank, built in part on the same logic fishermen had already been using to lend each other money for boats. Habit 5. Insurance got built from scratch when nobody else would sell it. Commercial insurers in this era were either uninterested in writing policies for working-class immigrant fishermen or priced coverage so high it defeated the purpose. The community's answer was the same one Italian immigrant communities built in cities across the country: mutual aid societies, where members paid in small regular dues that funded sickness benefits, funeral costs, and support for families when a breadwinner couldn't work, which, for a fishing community specifically, wasn't a hypothetical risk. The ocean took lives. A memorial mass is still held annually for fishermen and seamen lost at sea, followed by a fishing boat parade and memorial ceremony. A tradition with roots stretching back to exactly the era this story is about, when the danger of the trade made some form of communal financial safety, net less a nice idea and more an obvious necessity. Habit 6. The catch and the cart were two separate businesses, and the smartest families ran both. It's tempting to think of fishing as the whole economy here, but the wharf only worked because of the layer of commerce sitting right on top of it. And Italians dominated more of that layer than most people realize. By the turn of the century, Italians made up a disproportionate share of certain trades around the wharf and beyond it. A large share of the city's hucksters and peddlers, the truck farmers feeding the city's produce demand, and even the scavengers and teamsters moving goods around San Francisco more broadly were heavily Italian. A family that controlled both the catching and the selling, or the growing and the peddling, captured profit at two stages of the same transaction instead of one, which meant the same pound of fish or crate of produce was generating income twice over for the household that handled both ends of it. Habit 7. Land in San Francisco meant something land back home never could. For Ligurian and Sicilian families especially, the drive to own property wasn't abstract. Many had left regions of Italy where land ownership was locked up by a small number of families for generations, with most rural people working soil they'd never be permitted to own outright. Buying even a modest property in San Francisco, a storefront, a small house, a stake on the newly filled land along the waterfront, wasn't just a financial decision. It was the resolution of a problem that had defined their families for longer than anyone could remember. This is part of why so much of this neighborhood's wealth ended up looking like real estate and small storefronts rather than visible luxury. The property itself was the goal, not a means to display anything. Habit 8. Skills that never touched cash still functioned as income. A huge share of the goods and services a North Beach household needed simply never generated a cash transaction at all, because someone nearby already had the relevant skill. Net repair, boat maintenance, basic carpentry, tailoring. These moved through families and neighbors without a dollar changing hands, but they kept money inside the household that would otherwise have left it permanently. A torn net mended by a cousin instead of bought new, a leaking roof patched by a neighbor instead of a contractor. None of it shows up in any historical record of wages or prices, but multiplied across a few dozen exchanges a year. It functioned exactly like extra income for households that had access to this kind of internal trade, and didn't for households that didn't. Habit 9. The church and the neighborhood were the financial network, not just the social one. Saints Peter and Paul Church, still standing at the edge of Washington Square today, wasn't only a religious anchor for this community, it was also where a lot of the informal financial trust described above actually got built and maintained. Baptisms, weddings, and funerals all ran through the same institution, which meant the same people who prayed together on Sunday were the people who'd vouch for each other's credit, lend each other money for a boat repair, or look out for a widow's family if a fisherman didn't come back from a trip. The social structure and the financial structure weren't separate systems running in parallel. They were the same system, observed from two different angles, and that overlap is exactly why reputation could substitute for collateral in a way it never could in a more anonymous part of the city. Habit 10. The goal was never to look rich, it was to actually be secure. Visible spending, fashionable clothes, eating out, flashy furniture carried real social weight in a lot of American households of this era. In North Beach, the markers that actually signaled success looked almost invisible from outside the family. A boat owned outright instead of fished on shares, a small storefront with no debt attached to it, a little money quietly put toward land, nothing borrowed from outside the community that hadn't already been repaid. A household chasing visible status has to keep spending to maintain appearances, even when conditions get harder. A household whose entire definition of success was already invisible. Ownership, no debt, a stake in land. Never had to change its behavior when a bad season hit, because that behavior wasn't a reaction to hard times. It was the plan the whole way through. So, what actually built the wealth? None of these 10 things, taken individually, look like a strategy for getting rich. Selling bread instead of mining gold. A second income nobody recorded in any census. Cash split across more than one hiding place instead of trusted to one bank. A boat sold at exactly the right moment to fund a storefront instead of a bigger boat. A loan from a paisano instead of an institution that wouldn't have given one. A mutual aid society standing in for an insurance company that refused to write the policy. A skill traded between neighbors instead of paid for. A church that doubled as a credit network. Land bought instead of furniture. And a definition of success that an outsider walking past the house would never have noticed at all. Stacked together, sustained across 2 or 3 generations, and repeated through hundreds of Genovese, Ligurian, Sicilian, and Tuscan families who all converged on the same few blocks of reclaimed San Francisco shoreline. This is how a community that started with 229 people chasing gold in 1850 ended up, by the early 1900s, owning fishing fleets, restaurants that still carry their founders' names, and a bank built explicitly around the financial habits the community had already been practicing for decades. It wasn't one trick, and it definitely wasn't luck. It was every piece of this system, run consistently by people who had no other system available to them, and who built one anyway, out on the docks, one boat and one loan and one Sunday at Saints Peter and Paul at a time.